Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Performance Cafe. It is lovely to have you here, and if you watched last week, you will know that we are doing a quick fly through of a book by Dr. Ali Abdaal called Feel Good Productivity. And in this book, his whole premise is that a lot of issues that we have around procrastination, which of course negatively impacts productivity, is that we are actually trying to work without having any fun in the process. And we're not working towards feel good. If we have a problem with something and we're procrastinating, people go, have discipline, you should be motivated. And he's saying maybe it's more about how much fun can I have with it? How can I make a pleasant experience out of this? Now, last week we spoke about energizing, and we spoke about how to put the energy back in tasks, how to energize ourselves with regards to certain tasks. But he also speaks of something else, and this is what we're going to be talking about this week, and that is unblocking. And his whole idea is that when we procrastinate, we're actually doing it because there's something that is blocking our energy to move in that direction. So he says if we remove the blockage, then the procrastination should disappear as well. So let's take a look at what he says, which three things he highlights as being good for unblocking. The first thing that he says is that clarity is a good way to unblock someone who's procrastinating. The reason for this, and I've seen this in myself as well, is that often it's not laziness that leads to a lack of work. It's uncertainty about what the expected outcome is, what the conditions are for success. And what does it look like? What does it feel like? We assume when we say to someone, do X, we assume that they can understand exactly where we're coming from, what our expectation is. And then what would happen, and I've seen this so much, specifically when I work with younger interns and people who haven't been around business for very long, is they are too scared to put up their hand and go, I don't understand. I'm not clear on this expectation. I know that I used to have that problem when I started working. So one of the things I would do is if someone said to me, write a report, I would within 24 hours give an outline of the points I would consider in the report and send this to them and say to them, if this was the table of contents, am I adequately covering what you wanted me to cover? Right? So a lack of clarity can really upset the apple cart. And as a strengths coach, I'm forever telling people that we always say that, if the research shows that if you have out of your 34 strengths, the same strengths as someone else in the top 5 in exactly the same order. So only 5 out of the 34 strengths are in the top 5 in exactly the same order. The likelihood of that happening is 1 in 64 million, I believe. Well, if you think about it, if just having the same strengths as someone else is that rare, then I think that we should really start communicating with everyone around us as if they are less likely to understand, not more likely. Let's not assume, let's rather make that clarity. The next blocker that he speaks of is actually fear. And I must say, I have found that such an eye-opener because very often we consider fear as something that makes me so scared that I'm going to break out in sweats. But actually, sometimes just a small niggle that repeats itself enough during the day is enough to actually create that fear eventually. So, for example, I recently spoke to someone who said, I have a boss who's very difficult. And what happens is I will write the same format of report over and over and over. And every time I give it to him, no matter how hard I've tried, he'll always try and reformat something. And so therefore, I basically just fear that I'm never going to give him anything that he is happy with. And so it's so interesting that we realize that fear might not be roaring in your face like a lion. It might be just something that is slowly digging a little hole by scratching away, like water with a canyon. It takes years and years, but the water just wears it away entirely. And so I think there's also different ways that we would see fear, right? It's not the fright or flight necessarily. If it is the fight or flight, we will see paralysis. which means that we won't move forward because our body slows us down so we don't hurt ourselves. But what we do see here is little niggling concerns around, am I good enough? Am I the right person to be completing this task? Am I the right person for the job? We see that imposter syndrome can play a huge part here, where we know that people will be given tasks or jobs or roles. Other people consider them valuable and other people consider them up to the task, but they themselves don't. And so what happens is it becomes like, I believe in you. Why aren't you doing this? Why are you procrastinating? Are you lazy? Actually, it's just fear that I'm not good enough, that I'm not the right person for the job. And so from that perspective, I think we see that fear, in whatever vestige it shows up in, can contribute to procrastination. The problem is, of course, this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if I'm given something and someone believes in me and they give me this task to do and I don't complete the task on time or at all, even worse, then that means that they won't believe in me. And we will know that that trust has been broken. So therefore, the next time we go and we do something, we will feel even worse, do even worse, perform even worse, be judged more, and therefore this whole cycle just keeps on repeating itself. And so we see how insidious that fear actually can become. The third area that he highlights is getting started. And I think that's one of the most difficult things. When we procrastinate, it's because we just don't know where to start. Some part of this problem is, as we've said, that uncertainty. But sometimes a part of that problem is just the nature of perfectionism. So what we often see with people who procrastinate is not that they are too lazy, but they are so focused on doing it perfectly the first time, or, getting it right, like out of the gate, that what we land up with is someone who's too scared to start in case they don't get it perfect the first time. Now, what's really interesting, and I think Dr. Ali mentions it in his book as well, is that sometimes books can be revised up to 15 times before they get published. So he learned to say to himself, you don't have to get it right the first time, because you have the opportunity to keep on improving this. And I think I've seen that so often with people who even a small chore they won't do because they get so hooked on doing this perfectly that by the time they're done, they've overwhelmed themselves with activities. So, for example, you're standing in your kitchen and you have to throw out, you've got to clean the bin in the kitchen. Now, where I live in South Africa, we have big bins outside. So now what I've got to do is I've got to take the little bin bag and I've got to go and drop it into the big bin, excepting it's Tuesday, the day after the big bin was cleaned. It's still outside. So now I have to actually first go back into the house, close the dogs into the house, because otherwise they run out of the doors if I open any of the gates to go outside. Then I have to walk around, bring the big bin in, then take the little bag, put it in the big bin, then go back and lock all the doors, right? All of a sudden, throwing away a bag of trash has become a huge effort. And it's in those moments that we sort of go, oh, I'll just do it tomorrow, or I'll do it later, until we get to that point where if we don't do it right now, we're going to be in trouble. And then it's a distressing task. It's no fun, right? So Dr. Ali talks about how do we just get ourselves started? Now, he uses the 5-minute technique where he says, right, I'm going to sit down and work on this thing for 5 minutes. Even if I don't finish it, I'm just going to work on it for 5 minutes. In fact, he's quite strict about only sticking to 5 minutes. So even once he gets on a roll, he'll interrupt himself and come back to this later. Now, personally, I use the 5-minute rule, but once I'm going, I just leave myself there so I can just get the darn thing done. The reason for this is actually a very simple one, and that is that once I'm in flow, I'm moving so fast and I'm making progress so quickly that I don't want to stop. I'm actually then in the place of flow, of enjoyment, of engagement. But he actually says that he insists on sticking to 5 minutes and then stopping, only so that he doesn't sort of lie to himself by knowing, yes, I know I'm going to say 5 minutes, but if I go over, it'll be fine. So he's quite good at sticking to the 5 minutes. Another interesting case study in this that proves this point as well is Ernest Hemingway. And apparently he suffered greatly from writer's block. So what he would do is, if he had been writing, at the end of the session, he would make sure that he leaves a paragraph or a sentence incomplete. Because he believed that the empty piece of paper is actually what brings on the writer's block. It's like there's nothing to start with, right? It can go anywhere. And so what he would do is he would leave the sentence unfinished. So the next morning when he got up and started writing again, what he would do is he'd have to complete that sentence, and then he would just continue the flow from there. So one of the ways that I like using that same advice is, I'm not much of a writer, but I do love conceptualizing my thoughts through imagery. So what I would do is I would start doodling at one point what I'm thinking. It's like, what do I want to talk about in this perspectives? What is it that I want to write in this report? And I would almost like bullet point or mind map it, and then know that tomorrow I can just pick up where I left off by turning the mind map into whatever the final product is. And I think that's the interesting thing, is that more often than not, getting started, it's like when you abseil, when you have to go down that cliff, you've got to put your foot down, the first foot down, and then lean back into against the rope. That is the scariest. Once you've moved your weight there, then gravity and hopefully a lot of skill takes care of the rest for you. So if last time we spoke about energize, it was about picking up our energy and getting us in the mood to do something. Unblocking is much more deep-seated. It is about us looking at, do I really understand the requirements? And do I know that I have everything in place in order to fulfill those expectations, right? Clarity. Next up, in understanding the requirements, is there something here that I fear is not going to work out, will go wrong, and will come back to bite me? How do I deal with those things before I even start the task? Because then I can remove the fear and move on. And then thirdly, just get started. Set that egg timer for 2 minutes or 5 minutes and just take the pen, start writing, doodling, creating the mind map, whatever it is. But the moment that you've unblocked, you can then move forward. And then especially if you've paid attention and added things into the process to make things fun and you're energizing yourself, well, then you are more than 3/4 of the way to getting this done. As always, I hope that you've enjoyed this excerpt. And next week, we'll be talking about sustain. And sustain is about what happens if I start procrastinating in the middle of a job instead of at the beginning. And so if you've enjoyed this, please go and take a look at our website, formforward.com, where you will find this entry, or you'll find this video written up as a blog. We are also always welcome to come to all of our social media channels, leave comments, questions, let us know what you think or what you'd like to hear about. But then, until next week when we speak sustain, I look forward to seeing you at the Performance Cafe.